That I'll call to order the council meeting of Tuesday, August 21st. Looking to the agenda, are there additions to the agenda? Ms. DeSoto?
Yes, Your Worship. Administration would like to add 2 in-camera items. The first one is the Peaks Judicial Review decision, and that is going in camera under Section 27(1)A, privileged information. The second one is Municipal Development Plan Amendment Strategy, and that one is in camera under MGA Section 24(1)A, advice from officials.
Thank you. That I'll move the agenda be approved as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking to the minutes of July 3rd, 2018, are there errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move they be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item G1, Peaks Landing Fee Waiver Request. Who's presenting? Mr. Fark.
Okay, good evening, Mayor Borman, members of council. So indeed, the item before you this evening, first up, is Peak Landing fee request. So we'll start off with the recommendation. There's a slight modification from what was included in your agenda package. And the recommendation is that council set the application fees for amending the land use bylaw and for the subdivision of Peaks Landing at $0. I believe that everybody is familiar with the parcel. However, for those who may have forgotten, there are 3 parcels. They are adjacent to the power line in the Peaks of Grassy neighborhood and in close proximity to Quarry Lake. So there are a few considerations that we would like council to consider as part of this decision. The first one being there was recently a decision by Justice Gates on a review or a judicial review of the original Peaks of Grassy bylaw. There were a number of grounds that were brought forward by the applicant in that case that Justice Gates looked at and addressed. Ultimately, Justice Gates determined that the bylaw should be quashed due to a requirement in the MDP that parcels adjacent to environmental reserve would require an EIS. At the time that the original application for the Peaks of Grassy land use was brought forward in 2014, administration at that time looked at the existing policy set and they determined, or in their opinion, an EIS was not required by the intent of the MDP. Their determination was based on the fact that this was a small parcel of ER that was designated as ER due to its steep grade and rocky outcrop and not because of any other environmentally sensitive component. So at that time, they felt that they had the discretion to have, or that they had discretion, in fact, to propose not having the requirement for the EIS. They brought that to the attention of the council at the day during the first Peaks of Grassy application, so that was included in the staff report to that council at that time. So council was aware of the fact that administration was recommending that no EIS be required. And it was on that basis that Justice Gates determined that the bylaw that was passed by council eventually to rezone the land needed to be quashed. Essentially, the ruling was that if you include in a statutory document and impose upon yourself a requirement to do something, then council does not have the discretion not to do that requirement. So in this case, there was not latitude afforded to administration or council to consider whether or not the requirement for an EIS meant the intent of the MDP at that time, because the language was very clear that any parcel adjacent to ER would require a EIS. So the reason why I've explained this all to you is that the decision that was taken at the time to not require an EIS was recommended by administration and agreed to by council. This was not a proposal or a request from the applicant at that time. The applicant did prepare an environmental review and did provide that information to the town as part of their application. So that the bylaw has been quashed was not through any fault of the application or of the applicant, in this case the owners, the current owners of the parcels there. And so given that they moved forward and they met the requirements that were required by the town at that time, and that the bylaw has now been quashed, that is the main reason why administration is recommending that fees not be applied a second time, given that it was not the applicant's fault that the bylaw was quashed. Since the decision of Justice Gates, there was obviously an internal review. The applicants have indicated that they have an intent to bring forward a new application, which is essentially the same application as the one that was brought back previously and approved by council. One significant difference is that this time we are proceeding with an EIS and a third-party review. This is despite the fact that the MDP has since been amended and an EIS would actually no longer be required for these parcels. However, out of an abundance of caution and to address concerns of the residents of that neighborhood, we are moving forward. The applicant has agreed to move forward with an EIS, and the town will move forward with a third-party review of that EIS. So we have a new application that is coming forward. And another important consideration here is that the majority of the work for this application has been completed already once, in fact twice, but once and approved by council. So although there will be some work in terms of updating and renewing some of the review work that was done, the district is expected to remain essentially the same as it was previously, as are the conditions around subdivision. So aside from the EIS and the third-party review, administration is not expecting a significant amount of work associated with bringing this application forward to council at first reading for council's consideration. The fees that are being requested to be waived are the ones that are listed there on the overhead for your review. So there is the fees to amend the land use bylaw to allow for a change of the district from urban reserve to the direct control district that was previously approved. And those fees would be just under $4,000. And then the additional subdivision fees, which are approximately $12,000, totaling, all told, just under $16,000 in fees. So the MGA sets out that council has the authority to set fees, and the setting of fees or the reduction of fees is something that council has done previously. Two recent examples of this are the church at the bottom of Silvertip had approximately $80,000 worth of fees waived, or essentially fees reduced. Their fees were capped at $10,000, and that was in support of the church development, and that was for development permit and building permit fees. And then for the Coast Hotel rental apartment development that came to council in January of 2016, council waived the subdivision and the land use fees in that case in order to incentivize the development of purpose-built rental. And those fees total also approximately $18,000. That essentially concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks very much, Mr. Fark. I have a question. It's not substantive in nature, just on the calculation of the fees that would be required to be paid. When I looked at the 2018 fee schedule online, it had slightly different numbers. So it was, for instance, land use bylaw amendment in the fee schedule shows it 600 per hectare, and this calculation is 568.40, and a similar small difference on the subdivision fee. Is that simply an error, or am I missing something?
So I would actually have to look at Ms. Watenko, who did the calculation.
The difference is about $400, not.
So I don't have the fee schedule in front of me. We can certainly confirm what those numbers are.
Yeah.
It's
hectarage.
Yeah, it's done on a per hectarage basis. Yeah.
Okay, so that would be recalculated or?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the recommendation is to set the fees at 0. If council choose to set it at a different number, that would be at council's discretion. And if the council chose not to do that and to have the actual fees, full fees apply, then we would confirm those fees at the time of the application.
And in regards to the third-party review that we will be doing, it's noted that as per our EIS policy, the cost of the third-party review would be the town's cost.
That is correct. So that was an explicit decision of council at the time that the MDP and the the EIS policy was passed by council, that they did not want the developer to pay the cost of the third-party review in order to remove any sense that there could be a bias or interference. And so to ensure the true independence of the third-party review, council elected that fee should be wholly paid by the town.
And just sort of ballpark, what would the third-party review cost the town then?
For this application, the ballpark is somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000.
Thank you. Councillor Stanford?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Park. I'm just wondering if this application has been put through a number of times in the past, and each time the development fees have been paid, or the application fees have been paid?
That is correct. The previous 2 times.
On 2 separate occasions?
On
right.
2 separate occasions, the full fees have been paid. That is correct.
Okay. And the other question I had for you, the EIS that's being prepared is only in relation to that ER land, that one block of ER?
No. So with the updates and changes to the MDP, the EIS and the scope of the EIS is being determined between our third-party reviewer and the developer's consultant, but it will look at wildlife habitat, environmentally sensitive areas, so it is not restricted or limited to discussion of that sliver of environmental reserve.
So it's encompassing the whole adjacent lands, whatever is adjacent?
There will be a local study area that will look at the local factors, and a regional study area, yes. So it will be similar to other EISs that are being done.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from members of council? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation. With that, then I'll move the council waive the application fees for amending the land use bylaw and for subdivision of Peaks Landing and set the fee at 0. Is that the recommendation? So I'll put that motion forward. And speaking to it, I won't support the motion. I appreciate the fact that the developer has already paid quite a bit in the way of fees to move this project forward, not once but twice. And there's certain rationale to not applying the fees a 3rd time. I appreciate the rationale. But the reality is, in my mind, there's going to yet be a great deal of work on this file from Planning Department with 3 readings, public hearing, and all that goes on around that sort of an application. So I'm certain planning will be heavily worked by this process. And I'm cognizant of the fact there will be the cost of the town for the third-party review, which Mr. Fark noted was tens of thousands. So for those reasons, I won't support waiving of the fees. And I look for comment from other councillors. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. For much of the same reasons that you've articulated, I wouldn't be able to support the recommendation as well.
Any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. And the question is around waiving the fees. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried or defeated unanimously. Moving on to item G2, Larch Ice Rink Lifecycle Replacement Budget Increase. Oh, let me turn that on for you.
Yeah, okay. Your Worship, members of Council, I'm Lisa Guest, Supervisor of Parks, and I'm here today to ask for some additional funds relating to the daycare outdoor rink replacement. With my recommendation being that Council approve an additional $145,000 to the capital project to be funded from the General Capital Reserve. Okay. The rink was due for Lifecycle in 2016. This is a slide of the original site with the aerial overview of the new land housing development in yellow, and the orange is the new rink replacement location. The rink was approved as part of the 2017-18 budget for $540,000. It was delayed from being built in 2017 so that the housing could go in first, so we could get the correct location for that rink to go in so it wasn't too close to housing. We did online public consultation and we had a public open house. So this is just another slide of that location. And after that public consultation was completed, we heard from our residents that they would like some higher fencing for public safety, permanent removable pickleball posts for drop-in play, just like we have at the tennis courts. And the rink moved further north, as you can see in this picture. Wrong way. So the discussion I have for you today is my funding request would be for engineering services and geotechnical work, additional groundwork relating to that geotechnical and engineering work that was completed, some electrical to hook up the lights. There's the higher fencing and the permanent pickleball footings that has been requested from our public. Unfortunately, we have higher costs have come in for the rink due to tariffs on steel and so forth that can be found in the concrete base and the rink boards framing. And then I have a contingency there, which I have increased to $68,500 due to the cost being higher of the project in general. We received 2 bids for this project. One came in at $580,000 and the other at $768,000. So they were our 2 bids. We've actually had a conversation with the low bidder at the $580,000, and they have honoured their pricing until August 23rd for us, until this conversation is completed today, and they could start work as early as this week, moving forward to have the rink completed, if this was approved, by mid-November, ready for flooding at the end of November. If we were to not approve, the funds weren't approved, we would likely be going back to, we would cancel the project this year and we would go back next year and put in a new capital project at a higher cost for retendering in 2019. We looked at alternatives as soon as our pricing came back for this project. decreasing the rink size to try and meet the scope while still maintaining and having a rink. Unfortunately, this isn't going to work for us long-term as an asset, for a long-term asset. When we recycle or life cycle our Zamboni we currently use at the rink, the new ones are longer and they won't make the turns in the newer, in a smaller rink. So they won't make the turns in the current rink we have either, or at Cougar Creek, unfortunately. So we had originally scoped only 4-foot fencing. Sorry, we currently have 4-foot fencing at the rink, and we had increased that to 8-foot fencing. But when we heard back from our community, we thought the best thing to do was to go to a 16-foot fencing. So both ends of this rink will have 16-foot fencing for public safety. Currently, as an example, at Cougar Creek, we only have a 4-foot fencing with an additional 6-foot net, and we are still seeing pucks go over that net, unfortunately. It was an error on my part, and I'll admit that. The engineering and the geotech I had missed, but I'm really glad that we did catch that up front because it was very important for the longevity of this rink, being concrete and being moved to the new location, that we have a proper sub-base and groundwork done based on the location of the rink. We have pushed it further north, away from the new housing, as a recommendation from, well, our residents have asked for that as well, and as a recommendation from the geotechs. But it's also made that that ground is a little more uneven there, and so we have additional earthwork to do. To date, we've spent $15,000 on engineering work to get this project off the ground, and the request for funds would come from the general capital that has approximately $9 million currently in that reserve. So, I guess I'm here to ask that Council approve an additional $145,000 to the capital project to be funded from the general capital reserve. Is there any questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I have 1 or 2 questions. Others probably do as well. So, as part of the additional funding required, there's the $68,500 for contingency, which is 10% of the total budget cost. So, was there no contingency in the original budget that was approved?
There was little contingency, yes.
Little.
Little.
Very little.
Small.
And on the increased height of the chain link fence,
Yes.
the capital project sheet does suggest that there'd be a higher than average chain link fencing.
That's correct. So we have 4-foot fencing currently, and we had increased in our scope to go to 8-foot. We've actually gone to 16 feet in some areas. And you suggested if this moves forward tonight, it would likely be ready for winter use? This is correct. We've got, we have tentatively attained this contractor. He's honoured all his pricing, and we have contract documents ready to go if we are successful today. Great. The last question I have is, what's this pickleball? Okay. Well, is there anybody in town that plays as we all get older, we'll start playing pickleball. No. We see this as home for our pickleball community, which is a big deal. Tennis has a home, and as you know, pickleball has been looking for a home. So we are really excited to get them into this facility. Oh, okay. Well, I better. Yeah, I remember the pickleball discussions back about 10 years ago. Okay. When there was a grant available, and we built it up there in the rink that got flooded out. No, 2 days later. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I have no other questions. Other members of council have questions? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Ms. Guest, for your presentation. I'm just wondering, how will you sort of interface that pickleball, the footings for the pickleball with the sheeted ice for the winter use? Yeah, so they are
We have 4 pickleball courts, I believe, there. 2 will be permanent removable posts, just like tennis, so they can come out of the ground, and then there's a cap that flips over, and that is sealed, so we can flood straight over the top.
Okay, so that interface has been well examined?
Yeah, and that's part of my engineering.
Okay. And I'm wondering, so the fence height that you're proposing here, is that part of the bid? Are they providing the fence, or is that an add-on cost?
No, that's
to the bid?
already been, we put that in after we'd done public consultation. We put that in as an option, so it could always be removed if it had to be.
And so are they bidding on putting that fence in, or are we
Yes,
just?
they've already bid on putting that. That includes the 540,000 that I've already got in the budget, plus this additional I'm asking for includes that. So it's I needed, for the fencing height, I needed an additional 12,000, or it was 8,000 for the fencing and 4.5 for the pickleball footings, if I break that out.
Okay. And then you had a surprise increase of tariffs.
Yeah.
Because
I think
of
we did see that coming,
the
yeah, with the
international
steel.
nature of getting the supplies?
Yes, we can help the US for that, so, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, your presentation, Ms. Guest. I'm sure there's lots of residents that are looking forward to this being installed in that neighborhood and across town. I have a question about contingency. So when we, I know that the budget item number of $540,000 was a 2-year-old budget number, and so of course inflation and costing and everything has changed, and we rode that $450,000 number through. But how do we generally calculate contingency on projects? And are there some projects that more of a soft project that might have a lower contingency number versus a hard project that has a higher contingency number? Like I spoke with a friend of mine who's a project manager for the federal government for D&D, and they actually calculate 25% contingency in their projects, which is incredible when you're looking at $100 million projects. So I was just curious how we do that in your department.
So within my department, as you know, I'm operations, so I'll be honest here, I have never done a large-scale project like this. I think our standard is 15%. Would it be through engineering? I'm not 100% sure.
Mr. Park's going to help
Typically, I would do a lot more small-scale projects, so I personally have learned a lot from this myself, and I'm not going, I'll admit that, so I'm much more well-prepared.
So the amount of contingency carried on any given project is entirely project dependent, and it depends essentially on what the risk factors are per project. For larger construction projects, we would typically carry at least 10%, but for others, it depends on what the scenario is. So on a project like this, 10 to 15% would be considered more or less standard.
you. Thank you very much.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Ms. Guest, I don't see it in this report, but I know on the original report we talked about parking, keeping it small and trying to retain the trees. Are we still looking at that concept? I imagine that hasn't changed.
I think that's part of site, and it's actually not relating to the Rink project, the daycare Rink itself.
I thought parking was part of this.
No, this is actually a standalone project.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thanks.
Any other questions for Ms. Guest? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
That I'll move the council approve an increase in funding for capital project number 7037, the daycare lands outdoor rink replacement from $540,000 to $685,000, with $145,000 funded from the general capital reserve. And I'll support this motion. Our council several years ago made a very strong commitment to see this project through, and I think we have to. It's been expanded a little bit, but the additions and the changes are quite reasonable. In fact, more than reasonable. They'll make it a better project. It's unfortunate that some of the increased costs have occurred. They're not things that could have been foreseen, I suppose. But I'm happy to support the motion to increase the funding. Councillor Seeley?
I too will support this. It's been a long time coming, and I do like the improvements, especially the concrete and the addition of pickleball. I was really happy at the open house that came forward, and I think it's a great use of this project. So it's nice to see pickleball have its home.
Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. I too will be happy to support this project. This is a well-loved facility in that neighborhood and across town, and I couldn't imagine actually shutting that down. I am happy to see more uses being considered for this, and I can see how the budget number would have changed over 2 years, considering the world economic forces, what we're facing these days, and the state of our dollar. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing people play on it. So, thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Yep. Moving on then to item G3. Ms. Risling-Wynn.
Good afternoon, Mayor Borman, members of council. I'm here this afternoon to speak to you about the PACE program, PACE standing for Property Assessed Clean Energy. The intent of speaking with you about this today is to generate a conversation around PACE in the community, to explain a little bit about what a PACE program is, answer some questions, provide a little bit of clarity, and perhaps at some point in the future be bringing some additional items related to PACE back to you. So it gives you a bit of a chance to become familiar with the program and the language. And before I dive in too deeply, I just want to also acknowledge the support and championing of this project from Councillor Comfort. So what is PACE, which again stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy? And in essence, PACE is a financing tool. So it will allow Albertans to make affordable energy efficiency or renewable energy upgrades to their property, be that commercial, residential, or agricultural, with no money down, essentially. So you may be aware that the Government of Alberta recently passed legislation to enable PACE. They're currently working on the regulations and hope to be rolling that out later in the fall. So the cost of the upgrade would be recovered through the property owner taxes. And in addition to making it a financial tool for the property owner, it would also allow Albertans to make these improvements to their homes, create green jobs, and stimulate our local economies. So how does PACE work? So for municipalities, PACE, of course, will be voluntary. Once we understand the details of the regulation, we get to decide whether or not we want to offer it. To set up a PACE program, the municipality would then pass a PACE enabling bylaw, so that would be something we would bring back to council for your consideration. And then we would work with Energy Efficiency Alberta to deliver the program to residents. Energy Efficiency Alberta would also have a role. They would administer the PACE program on behalf of the municipalities that are choosing to offer the program, and this would also include covering much of the administrative work and securing the funding for the actual improvements, renovations, solar installations. For property owners, PACE would also be voluntary. So again, property owners don't provide money up front for those improvements. It would be collected through their property tax. The property owners who make the upgrade would see the increase on their property tax bill. So it's not like a local improvement tax where the entire block would see that additional payment on their property tax. It's only for that particular property. And so owners who choose to make an improvement would see, of course, the energy savings from their investment, and they would also reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially how PACE would work is the owner would decide to make a clean energy upgrade. They would sign an agreement with the municipality, which would allow us to register it on title and collect that remittance back through the property tax. The contractor would install the upgrade. The owner again would pay it back through property tax, and of course they would save on their energy bills, reduce their emissions, and contribute to a green economy. So obviously there's going to be a lot of detail embedded in each of those steps, which is why the province is working on those regulations now, and we want to see the details on that before we decide to move forward. So you might wonder what happens if you want to sell your property. So the property owner can pay back the outstanding amount of the improvement at any time, but if there was to be outstanding amounts and the property changed hands, the repayment would continue on with the title of the property. And so the new owners would continue to make the payments, but they would also enjoy the ongoing benefits associated with the improvement for their home. So PACE improvements will be eligible for residential, commercial, and agricultural projects and properties. It'll be focused on, we don't know what the full suite of the projects will look like yet, but they're typically energy efficiency related, water conservation, or on-site renewables, so solar power, upgraded insulation, windows and doors, high efficiency heating and cooling systems, those types of things. So in terms of next steps, again, the government is currently consulting with municipalities, lenders, real estate associations, and other stakeholders to develop those regulations and provide that guidance to municipalities that choose to participate. And the regulation will be brought forward for approval in the fall. The government is also working with Energy Efficiency Alberta, who will design the PACE program. They'll set up the administration, and that will, of course, include some tools for municipalities. And it's expected that the entire package, the legislation and regulations, will come into force in 2019. So next steps for us, once we've reviewed the final legislation and the regulations and understand the details of the program, we can determine whether or not we want to opt in. And should we choose to opt in, administration would bring forward a PACE enabling bylaw. So simply passing the expression of interest resolution here today will signal Canmore's interest in participating in PACE. And by being proactive, Canmore will be better prepared to work with the designated PACE administrator when the program is finalized and rolled out. So that's it. I imagine you probably have some questions, so happy to answer them.
Thanks very much. I'm just curious if there's any minimum or maximum value of project that would be considered, do you know?
No, I think, it has to be of reasonable significance, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be, that smaller projects would be excluded either, like if you wanted to replace all the windows in your home. In other jurisdictions, that's been contemplated. So again, the specifics haven't been rolled out to us, but it looks like it could be, smaller projects that may be bundled up to a large solar installation.
Strikes me as it could end up being quite a bit of money provincially invested in that. I mean, you get a large commercial building with full solar and storage batteries and everything else. I mean, it adds up to a lot of dough.
Yes.
So at this point, PACE is suggesting any amount would be supported. Well,
I'm not sure they would any amount. I think it would have to be, it has to be of significant value that it would warrant putting, registering on title and having it remitted through your property taxes, but I'm not sure what the bottom of the threshold will be.
I guess the ongoing costs, even though it's through property tax, would still be a factor in the consideration whether commercial enterprise could pay additional, could afford that additional expense or not. You also noted that the PACE would be preparing some a model bylaw, enabling
Yes,
bylaw.
yeah.
So the town could then use that as a template and modify it if we prefer, or would it be just as presented?
No, I believe their intention would be to provide a boilerplate bylaw that municipalities could adapt to their own needs. I imagine there'll be some sections that couldn't be amended as they reference, the overarching regulations and legislation and things with regard to the Municipal Government Act, but I think we will have the flexibility to amend it to meet our own needs as well.
Great. Mr. Fark, you had a comment?
Just to add to that and to build on that comment, my understanding of the program is that precisely in addition to the bylaw, municipalities will have the opportunity to build policy that would set parameters around what projects could or could not be considered. So as is always the case, this is an early on development of a regulation. The devil will be in the detail or in the regs when they come out, but there will be some discretion there.
Great. And you do note in the report that Finance Department feels we could accommodate the tracking and reporting that would be required.
Yes, yeah.
Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Worship. Thank you for your presentation. One of the examples that was presented in our staff report, or in the report on PACE, is that there might be third-party funds involved in funding or financing the projects. And so people would, in fact, apply for money through, not through the town of Canmore, but through a separate agency. They would be either the province of Alberta would be putting up money, or they would have a fund pool. And I'm just wondering if, when you're doing your analysis, if you look at what the payback terms would be, because I think if it's third-party funds, there's likely some interest costs factored into there, because the money would be loaned over a period of time. So
yeah, and I think it's fair to say that there may be some pieces such as just that, like what the interest, if there is interest applied,
sure,
to those upfront payments, what that would look like.
Yeah, so if you're drawing on a pool of funds and you're paying it back, there's likely to be some carrying cost for that fund. So I just thought it would be good to point out to you that in your analysis that should be something to look at.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions from members of council? Councillor McCallum?
I just have one. Is this just for residential properties, or would it be for commercial property as well?
Yep, commercial is also scoped in. Yep.
Right on.
If there's no further questions, Councillor Seeley?
So if you wanted to join this program, would an assessment of your property be conducted, and then windows, solar panels, would that all, and then would you have a choice of what you do, or are you all or nothing? Can you just do windows like you alluded to earlier?
I think it would depend on the property and what the homeowner has decided they want to do. In some cases, people can do an energy audit of their home, and it would make a bunch of recommendations in terms of things that they could do, like upgrade the insulation in your attic, or improve all of the windows, or install solar panels. So I think it would depend on the homeowner himself or herself in terms of what they wanted to see happen. Having that energy assessment, home energy audit done ahead of time can sometimes be really helpful to inform those decisions. But for example, if you wanted to do a residential solar installation, typically the homeowner hasn't done a home energy assessment. They've just decided they want to, they have solar potential on their property and they'd like to install a solar system. So
an overall assessment will be part of it, probably.
Potentially. I think that would be a piece of information that would be helpful for a homeowner if they didn't really know what they wanted to do.
Sure, okay.
Yeah.
And it would be a local improvement tax?
No, it would be done through the PACE program. Yeah.
PACE program, but it would be paid for through an improvement tax?
The home energy audit, you mean, or the actual improvements coming out of the audit? The actual improvements would be administrated and paid back through the PACE program, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's no further questions. Thanks very much for your report. Sounds pretty interesting. So I will move the council through an expression of interest. Consider participation in PACE once program details are considered. And I'll happily support that motion. This is really great to see the provincial government proposing a program such as this. I don't think it's much of a stretch of an imagination to see the future benefit to homeowners and business owners and municipalities and the province. So good for them to be leading this, and I'll look forward to seeing the proposed bylaw come forward. Councillor Comfort.
Yes, I will also support this, and I also want to commend Lori and her department for getting the information, following up, and creating an alliance actually with a number of other municipalities that are considering entering into this. I think it really speaks to our long-term goals for Canmore, ESAP, and the like, and I'm very pleased to see it go forward. So we'll see where the province takes it. Thanks a lot.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item G4, the Benchlands Trail Pilot Project. Mr. Kinsey, and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
New baby at home. Getting any sleep these days?
Getting more sleep than my wife is.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Good evening, Mayor and members of Council. I'm here this evening to provide an update on the Benchlands Trail Pilot Project. In my presentation this evening, I'll give a brief background on the project, a description of the data collection that we've gone through, an outline of the public participation process, and a summary of results and next steps. So just to provide a bit of the background, back in 2016, Council approved a capital project for pavement rehabilitation, and Benchlands Trail was chosen as a good candidate for a mill and overlay preventative maintenance project. Then again in 2017, Council approved an additional $100,000 budget, which was intended for intersection improvements on this project to improve active transportation. We embarked on a two-stage public participation process in December of last year. Stage one was what we called the discovery phase, where we sought to understand the full scope of issues that users were experiencing on Benchlands Trail. During that phase, we used an online mapping tool where residents were invited to drop a pin on a map and tell us about their experiences on Benchlands. We then worked with a consultant to design measures which we felt would help to alleviate some of the issues that we heard from residents. And then we took those concepts to an open house at Elizabeth Rummel School in the winter of this year. We came back to Council in March of this year, March 20th, because administration, after the open house and after chatting with people and really considering the concepts that we developed that were possible within the modest budget available to us, we began to have concerns as to whether or not these would be adequate to address some of the concerns we were hearing. So Council approved a pilot project, the intention of which was to determine whether or not we could accomplish our goals of decreasing vehicle speeds, improving safety and comfort for active modes users, and possibly reducing queue and delay times within the framework of this budget. We worked with our consultant to design the pilot according to the principles of the Integrated Transportation Plan, some of which include 3.3 meter lane widths for arterial roadways. We then looked at using flexible bollards, paint, to simulate the narrower lanes and curb extensions. The curb extensions on the Cougar Creek Drive intersections were intended to slow traffic as they entered the neighborhoods. And we also used the concrete TC barriers to provide an additional sense of comfort for pedestrians at crossing locations. So onto the data collection. We designed a program to collect data on several metrics, including 24-hour speed measurements at 3 locations on Benchlands Trail. We also measured traffic volumes in these same locations. We performed manual queue and delay measurements at both Cougar Creek Drive intersections. And we also performed qualitative observation of traffic patterns, so standing out at the intersections, watching how the pilot was functioning. So all of these measurements were done before the pilot was implemented and while school was in, with pilot measures in place and also with school in. And then lastly, after school had recessed for the summer, we returned with pilot measures still in place, and we continued to do those measurements. So in regards to speed, it was quite interesting. As we expected, we saw an initial drop in speed right after the pilot was implemented. So this graph, I won't go into too much detail, but essentially what this is showing is the black line that's furthest to the left is the speed that was measured right after the pilot was implemented. So we did see some marked decrease in speed right after the pilot. But then what we saw was within a week, speeds returned more or less to what we were seeing pre-pilot. Okay, so over a 24-hour period, we did not see a substantial decrease in speeds, nor did we see a substantial decrease or tightening of the distribution of speeds. So this is something else we look at, is not just the speed that people are traveling, but also the spread of speeds. So do you have some vehicles moving very quickly, some moving very slowly? It's better to have everybody within that same band close to the speed limit. What we did see was at peak times, we saw more of a decrease in speeds. And we also noticed of the 3 locations that the speeds in the vicinity of the roundabout were lowest, which to us suggests that the roundabout and the measures that were done there were successful in having some traffic calming effect. In regards to queue and delay, queuing is a measure of the number of cars waiting at an intersection. So in our case, these are cars on Cougar Creek Drive waiting to turn onto Benchlands Trail. Delay is the amount of time that a vehicle waits at an intersection. What we noticed was at the Summit Cafe intersection, we had a greater increase in queue and delay than at the lower intersection. And this we can explain by the fact that we measured many more vehicles turning right at the Summit Cafe intersection than the lower. And these vehicles were more impacted by the elimination of the right-hand turn lane than at the lower intersection, where far fewer vehicles are actually turning right. Most of them are turning left. I'll walk you through this graph really quickly here. On the vertical axis is delay time. So for each vehicle, this is the amount of time that they're waiting to turn onto Benchlands. And on the horizontal axis is the time of day. So 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., you'll notice this was chosen because this is the most acute time of day. This was on a school day as well. And the 3 lines are showing, the orange line is showing the queuing times with school in place and no pilot measures. Then the blue line is showing once we've implemented the pilot and school is still in, you see some increase in the amount of time people are waiting to turn onto Benchlands. But what's quite interesting on this graph is the green line, the pilot measures are still in place, but school has recessed for the summer. So what you'll see here is the change in delay time is far more significant in terms of whether school is in or not than the pilot measures themselves. So this was an interesting observation for us.
Councillor McCallum, you have a question?
Yeah, so just back to that slide. So would that then indicate that more people are driving in and out to Elizabeth Rummel than we would prefer or think they are, or? Yeah,
and I'll get to that a bit more later in the presentation,
right.
But certainly that's one of the conclusions, is that school pickups and drop-offs are definitely a contributing factor to congestion at these intersections.
And did we have an opportunity to monitor how many vehicles a day are going in that area just to do pickup and drop-off?
Well, we haven't monitored traffic at the school itself, but what we were able to do was look at this type of data. Obviously, there's a suggestion that the difference in the increment is directly attributable to the school traffic. I also wanted to make sure we were calibrating against the vacation period as well.
Of course, that was my second thought.
Yeah, fewer people driving to work because they're on vacation. I have a slide at the very end I can show.
All right, no worries.
No, but I'll explain it now because we're talking about it now. For overall volumes on Benchlands Trail, we saw a 17% change in volume with the vacation period, but only 3% of that, how would I explain this? Only 3% of that was attributable to vacation traffic. So if I'm just looking at the school drop-off time, there's really a 13% change in traffic volumes during the school time. And the difference between 13 and 17% I would attribute to people being on vacation. So there is some influence for the vacation period, but certainly the school drop-off influence is significant.
And in general, that particular part of the neighborhood, from my understanding, gets at least 2,500 car trips a day, correct?
So the volumes we're measuring on Benchlands Trail itself are 10,000 vehicles per day.
Yeah, I was thinking about.
Yeah, I don't have volumes on the Cougar Creek itself. Yeah.
All right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So once the pilot was in place, we launched a public participation, phase 3 of our public participation. Again, this phase consisted of an online mapping tool like we used in the first phase, where we asked residents to provide their feedback at specific locations. We also reached out to participants from phase 1 and 2 who would provide us their email addresses. We emailed them and asked them to participate again in this stage. We emailed affected stakeholders such as Rome and the school bus providers. We installed signage on site directing people to our website, and we used the newspaper and social media channels to inform residents of the opportunity for feedback. In all, we received 169 comments using the online tool and 95 emails. The emails, many of them contained multiple comments as well. So I'll provide a brief summary of what we heard then. We took this feedback and we compiled it by categorizing the results into broad themes, which are presented here. And then we further categorized them as whether the feedback received was negative or positive. The majority of the comments are from a vehicular perspective, which aligns with the mode share that we're seeing. Typically in Canmore, 80% of trips are made by vehicle, so one would expect the majority of feedback would be from a vehicular perspective. But we were pleased to see that a large proportion of the comments were also coming from people traveling by multiple modes. So by that I mean a lot of the emails we were hearing from people who drive, walk, and bike to get around town. We also heard a number of competing comments. For example, some people asking for more pedestrian crossings, while other people suggesting that we don't need any more. So I'll just walk you quickly through some of the comments that we heard for the corridor as a whole. I'll just bring up some quotes and I'll just describe them briefly. We heard that people riding their bikes downhill are accustomed to using the shoulder when they're on Benchlands, and that the pilot measures force them to take the lane, and that made cyclists feel uncomfortable. We also heard, as much as we encourage uphill cycling on the sidewalk, which is permitted for all ages, and the multi-use pathway, we've heard that people still choose to ride their bicycle on the street in the uphill direction. We did hear from pedestrians and drivers that they would like to encourage people riding their bicycles to use dedicated off-street facilities. We heard a number of comments about the aesthetics of the pilot. I feel that there was some misunderstanding, and this is perhaps on us for our communications. I feel a lot of people didn't understand that the measures were temporary, and that they felt they were permanent. And lastly, we heard from a number of people that they felt that vehicle speeds had not been impacted by the pilot project, and to the point where some people called for additional speed enforcement as a way to reduce vehicle speeds. At the intersections, we heard something which we observed firsthand as well, is that with the setback crossing design on the Cougar Creek Drive, that vehicles waiting to turn onto Benchlands Trail were yielding on top of the crosswalk, which obviously impairs the functionality of the crosswalk. We heard pros and cons in regards to the elimination of the right turn lanes. From the pro side, we heard from people saying that when a right-turning vehicle comes up beside you when you're turning left, it can be difficult to see, and then you have to wait for that vehicle to clear before you can go, and vice versa. But I would say we heard quite a few more negative comments about the elimination of the right turn lane, and specifically at the Summit Cafe intersection, where there are a large number of right-turning vehicles. Lastly, at the Summit Cafe intersection, some of the Rome transit operators commented to us that with the curb extensions, it was challenging for them to maneuver into position at the bus stop right in front of Summit Cafe. As part of the pilot project, we simulated 2 potential mid-block crossings, one at the Bike Skills Park and one at Settlers Way. For these, we heard a number of comments from people who are excited about the prospect of having crossings at these locations. Again, we also heard from people suggesting that additional crosswalks are not needed. Clearly, as you can see with the desire lines in the grass here at Settlers Way, there does exist a need and a desire from pedestrians for these crossings. And the proposed crossing down by the Bike Skills Park would facilitate getting people riding and people walking onto the multi-use pathway, especially when you consider that the bridge over Highway 1, there's only a pedestrian facility on the east side. So for people coming from downtown, if they want to use the multi-use path, they either need to cross at the signals or wait until they get to the first Cougar Creek Drive intersection. So a crossing by the Big Skills Park would hopefully encourage people to use the multi-use pathway. So a brief summary of the results and our observations. The pilot project successfully demonstrated that the modest changes are not adequate to accomplish the stated goals of decreasing vehicle speeds, improving safety and comfort for active modes users, and possibly reducing queue and delay times. Another of our conclusions, as discussed earlier, is that school traffic has a greater influence on congestion than the pilot measures themselves. Through our observations, it's clear that the right turn elimination at the Summit Cafe intersection negatively impacted traffic flow. From the feedback we've heard from residents, there is a clear desire for better cycling and pedestrian facilities and crossings in this corridor. And also through the feedback, it's clear from the community that there's a desire for improved traffic flow during school times at these intersections. So our next steps, the data collection is complete. The pilot measures are no longer required, and they will be removed within the next couple of weeks. The town administration will continue to support the school travel planning exercise that's currently underway with Elizabeth Rummel School. We feel that helping ERS find ways to identify and eliminate obstacles so that we can encourage children and parents to walk, bike, or take the bus to school will help accomplish some of our goals. We'll propose intermediate works in 2019 and possibly a larger capital project as part of the 10-year capital plan. And more details on these will be provided in October as part of the budget process. So thank you for your attention, and open the floor to questions.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So the CAP 1637, will we still follow through with that project in terms of the pavement rehab?
So Benchlands Trail is in dire need of a mill and overlay.
No, I know.
I anticipate that we would proceed with the mill and overlay next year.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Comfort.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So I didn't realize you said, I believe I heard you say uphill cycling on the sidewalk is permitted for all ages?
Yeah, that is an exception to the bylaw, and it's specifically signed. There are painted decals on the sidewalk itself that permit uphill cycling only for all ages.
In that area only?
Yeah, so from the Highway 1 overpass, well actually, all the way from Bow Valley Trail
Okay.
up to the roundabout, or up to the Summit Cafe intersection, because at the Summit Cafe intersection, it changes to an asphalt multi-use path.
And what about other hills, like, you know?
To my knowledge, that's the only one where that is permitted. And it's exceptional, and I think something we could do for the community is to help publicize that and make sure that people are aware of that.
Yeah, because I certainly wasn't.
Mhm.
And I have another question, if I may, Your Worship. And that, or just a comment, really. The school travel planning is a great initiative, and I'm really pleased to help. Really pleased to hear that the town is working together with the school, with parents, to try and increase multi-modes of travel. So that's great. Thank you very much.
Are there questions from members of council? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Kinsey. So when you move forward with the other proposed traffic calming, or when you're talking about going to the next steps, we've done a pilot on this, and you've gotten feedback. So as you move forward, is there going to be a potential for another pilot, or are you going to just move forward with ideas that came out of this pilot to enhance what you're doing here?
Yeah, good question. So certainly, we're still formulating what we would propose for 2019 and for a larger project in the long term. What I would see for 2019 is relatively modest. Probably, so certainly the mill and overlay and likely the 2 new additional crossings. Any more significant investment would require council approval. We'd probably see off-street cycling facilities. As to whether or not a pilot would be required, I think it's hard to say at this time. It would really depend on what administration is proposing. I would also think that if we're looking at the 10-year budget process, my expectation is there'd be an emphasis on the urban core and the Highway 1 overpass, and that a larger project on Benchlands Trail would probably come after those. So by that time, we would have plenty of experience with complete streets transformations and active transportation implementation. So my best guess is we would likely not need a pilot at that time.
So whatever happens here would be an extension of a bigger framework of improvements along that whole corridor.
Yeah, so when we come to council in October for the budget process, part of that is looking at implementing active transportation infrastructure throughout town. And one of the observations we made here is that really the weakness, part of the issue with the Benchlands Trail corridor is the weak link being the connection over the highway. And so really we need to improve the connection over the highway and on Benchlands Trail between the highway and Bow Valley Trail. It really makes sense to implement those before we make significant changes to Benchlands Trail on the hill itself.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. You just answered some of my questions, Mr. Kinsey, but 2019, you're going to come back. Is there going to be a change of scope a little bit? Would you require more funding? Because I would say it's a very successful pilot. You got all kinds of feedback and everything else. A lot of negative, but we learned from that, right? So I would say it was a successful pilot, and hopefully we can do more in 2019 to address some of the things we learned.
Yeah, and certainly Mr. Asarte and Ms. Ellick would be more involved in the development of future active transportation projects. So I think they would be the ones assessing a need for piloting in the future. But to your point, Councillor Seeley, we have learned a lot through this pilot project. I think it's been very beneficial. And some of those learnings will help us when we develop other projects in the future.
Councillor Hillstead.
Thank you for your presentation. Did we ever consider just doing like rumble strips or other style of paths that cause people to rumble and slow down if we're trying to reduce speeds? Just because I know in the ITP they talk about basically doing like essentially cobblestone paths and stuff that vehicles hit, slow down. Did we consider that at all with Benchlands Trail, or is there reasons for or against it?
Yeah, so certainly in the ITP for traffic calming measures, things like providing vertical elements and narrowing of lanes are preferred methods to slow traffic, particularly in a location like Benchlands Trail where you have houses backing onto the roadway. Rumble strips would probably be quite problematic in terms of the noise that they generate. And furthermore, speed humps or speed bumps are not necessarily appropriate on arterial roadways because they can hamper emergency services response, and they can be challenging for snow clearing as well.
Thank you.
So I know you'll be bringing back recommendations as part of the budgeting process. Will there be a discussion at council prior to budget, or will it only come to budget committee initially, or finance committee?
The proposal is to just come to the budget committee with the proposal.
And then I think I understood you to say that the additional crosswalks would likely be implemented with the 2019 project?
Yeah, so one thing I didn't describe in my presentation is that our consultant who has been assisting us with the data collection and the pilot itself, they're still working on completing their report. So unfortunately, we weren't able to have it for this evening. But once we have that, we'll have the recommendations for short-term implementation, and that's why I can't say for certain what the recommendations will be, but.
And if those do come forward, is it likely that the design would be similar to the one up by Summit, for instance, with some sort of safety factors or measures implemented?
Definitely that could be looked at. There's a warrant process to determine whether or not the flashing lights would be required, and that would be something that can be assessed at that time. Yeah, I can't say for sure right now whether or not the warrant would be deemed necessary at those locations.
Yeah, given the speed that some people travel that road in, it might be worthwhile.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, so how many people want us to put in permanent photo radar there? Is that one or 100?
We did have a few comments to that effect. Certainly it's not the approach the town would prefer to take. We'd rather that the road language is such that people travel an appropriate speed without the threat of enforcement.
Yeah, clearly we need to address those speeding issues in some way. Councillor Mara?
Thank you for your report. I just want to say thank you for being out there personally, as I live up in that area and I saw you sitting under the trees and watching all the traffic around.
Camouflage?
It was camouflage, yes. And I do agree that we have to work with the school. Because I live up there, I know, and a lot of people we know leave between this time and this time when it's school time, if you want to get out. So thank you.
Yeah, it is the one key learning for us as well is that the congestion it's a very short acute period of time.
Seeing no further questions, thanks very much for the presentation, and pass along kudos to engineering for moving forward in this manner. I think it was really a good call to start with the pilot project and try out some of the ideas. Clearly some of them didn't work, and now we can go back to a different approach rather than if we just put in all of the envisioned changes in a hard sort of a fashion, we'd be in a different position now. So I think it's great that engineering moved forward in a cautious way. We still need to address all of those issues that we were trying to find solutions for, but we'll keep working away at that. So thanks for your work and the rest of your co-workers engineering on this project.
Thank you.
That we'll move on to item G5. Yep, G5, the Human Wildlife Coexistence Report. Mr. Fark.
Good evening once again, Mayor Borman and members of council. I suspect you're going to be seeing a lot of me this evening.
Already have.
Too much, in fact. So I'm often given a hard time for the lack of finesse in my PowerPoint presentations. So I would just like to point out how hard I worked at putting this presentation together. There are beautiful graphics, there are pictures. I slaved to So, indeed, I am here before you this evening to request that you accept the Human-Wildlife Coexistence report for planning purposes. This is the presentation that was actually provided by the Wildlife Roundtable at the open houses. It provides a nice, concise summary of the technical report and where we are at. So I will run through that with you very briefly and then hopefully answer any questions you might have. And then hopefully you will approve that motion. So, for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is the Bow Valley. Obviously, it is an incredibly desirable place for people to visit, live, and recreate. And obviously, our valley bottom is also a critical corridor for wildlife, both from a habitat perspective and from a movement perspective. And bringing those two groups together is obviously resulting in some conflict and human-caused mortality of wildlife. As cute as she is, you don't really want to give her a scratch behind the ears. This was Bear 148. Everybody remembers that story from last year. The reason why Bear 148 is significant, she was just one of a number of bears that were lost in the valley last year. But the management of that case really helped to highlight some of the concerns that the agencies have working in the valley. Concerns such as enforcement capacity, differing management tools and approaches between the different agencies, obviously continued human activity in wildlife corridors, the risk of injury, and natural and unnatural foods in developed areas. So, although she was just one bear, she was a microcosm of many of the problems that we have in dealing with wildlife in the valley. Sorry. So, as a result of the goings-on last summer, what occurred was the creation of the Human-Wildlife Coexistence Roundtable. The roundtable was convened. Mayor Borman led that initiative together with MLA Cam Westhead and with Mayor Karen Sorensen out of Banff, brought together a number of provincial agencies as well. So the priorities, the intent was to reduce negative interactions between people and wildlife, particularly in developed areas, restoring or maintaining habitat, supporting safe recreation, and public transparency in decision making. So living near wildlife has been obviously an issue in the Bow Valley for a number of years. And speaking frankly, we've had quite some good success. There's been a number of really important programs and initiatives that have been implemented in the valley, many of them cutting edge and sort of leading. Obviously, you all remember the movie Living with Wildlife, which was done a couple of years ago, which highlighted some of the successes that we have had. But despite those successes, obviously, there are a number of challenges remaining as well, and that's what the roundtable was meant to address. So in addition to the two municipalities of Canmore and Banff, we had Alberta Provincial Parks, Parks Canada, Fish and Wildlife Enforcement, Environment and Parks Wildlife Management, WildSmart, CPAWS, and Yellowstone to Yukon, groups represented on the technical committee. So that technical committee that I just mentioned, we had subject matter experts from, obviously, from a number of these agencies. And they came together. Sorry, just give me a second here. I'm trying to manage two presentations at once. So they came together over a period of 6 months. There were meetings every 2 weeks, and then a number of working groups and smaller group sessions. And the intent was to identify major barriers to achieving coexistence and then find evidence-based solutions that could help to address these problems. Recommendations were informed by current issues and trends, available data, best practices, expert opinion, and the published literature. So what did the report conclude? It included, obviously, some discussion of the current state of affairs, including the successes and positive initiatives that have been taken so far, including those current mitigations. And then it had 28 recommendations grouped into 6 key areas, and then those recommendations were broken out into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. So the 6 key areas were transboundary management, which is essentially what to do when the bear crosses between the national park and the provincial park or into the town boundary. Wildlife in developed areas, so how do we deal with the elk on Lions Park, for example. Habitat security, food conditioning and habituation, people compliance, which is short for people don't comply, and then wildlife management. So an important note is that these 28 recommendations that came out of these 6 areas from the technical committee have actually been accepted by the round table. And so there was sort of a breakdown, and perhaps I'll explain that more clearly. So the round table was at a more senior level, so it included the CAOs, mayors, MLA, and heads of agencies from the province. The technical committee was more the operational or functional departments, the subject matter experts. And the recommendations from that technical committee were accepted by the roundtable. So what were the recommendations? On transboundary management, there is an identified need for continued cooperation and coordination between the agencies. There's a need for multi-agency training, ongoing collaboration, and then leadership. So years of scientific observation show us that wildlife benefit from a consistent and predictable management approach. Cooperation between all agencies working within wildlife management creates consistencies and enables ongoing knowledge exchange. So it can help us create an efficient and effective use of resources, create a better understanding of other agencies' challenges, support consistent communication, better evaluate the effectiveness of the current tools that we're using, create consistency in management, and identify and address knowledge gaps. So that's really the focus of the transboundary recommendations. So then we come to wildlife in developed areas. Obviously, education, enforcement, and ongoing assessment is critical here. Removing attractants and or excluding wildlife from accessing attractants and a reactive response. So our goal here is to discourage wildlife from frequenting areas, developed areas, because wildlife in close proximity to people obviously can potentially create conflict. Use of developed areas can often result in wildlife becoming habituated and or food conditioned, resulting in human-wildlife occurrences. So by finding ways to successfully encourage wildlife to use wildlife corridors and habitat patches, we can reduce conflict and increase safety of both people and wildlife. So some notes on the recommendations. Education, we really do need to educate the public as to the rationale for the need to keep wildlife out of developed areas. I can't count the number of times we've heard, but I like the elk in my front yard. Part of why I live in Canmore is so that I can be proximate to wildlife. As much as some of us can appreciate the sentiment involved in that, the reality is that that is neither good for wildlife nor for public safety. And so we need to educate the public to help them to understand why having the elk moving through a residential neighborhood is a problem. And the corollary of education, of course, is enforcement. So for those who refuse to be educated, then there needs to be a mechanism to increase enforcement capacity in order to gain compliance. We need to do ongoing assessments. again, to understand how things are currently functioning and to fill any knowledge gaps that, or to identify and then fill the knowledge gaps that we see. Habitat security. Obviously, if you're going to exclude wildlife from places where they are currently seeking refuge and finding habitat, you actually have to find ways to provide them with secure habitat that they can access. So there needs to be some mapping. A big one that we've talked about extensively is we need to reduce human footprint in the corridors. We need to have proactive seasonal closures, predictable patterns of human use, again, remove natural attractants from public areas. Some discussion about enhancing wildlife habitat. So that may include things like prescribed burns in certain locations, because the very dense forest that we have that surrounds the town, for example, is not prime wildlife habitat. It doesn't allow for good forage, it doesn't allow for good cover for wildlife. And then another item that we have talked about previously is strategic alternatives for recreating. So there's a reason why people are going into the corridors to recreate, and we need to find ways to create alternatives. If you just simply try to prohibit people from doing something, you're never going to be successful, because the incentive to engage in those activities outweighs the risk of being caught. One of the key ways that we can change that pattern of behavior is by providing alternatives, and reasonable alternatives within the development footprint. And then, of course, accomplishing all of those things will require a multi-agency approach to encourage wildlife to use in non-developed areas, and again, keep people out of the areas intended for wildlife. So food conditioning and habituation. So we need to stop feeding the wildlife. I don't know if anybody follows Facebook. In Facebook the last couple of weeks, there's been 2 examples of people either taking pictures or videos of very cute bears eating berries, either in their yard or adjacent to their properties, within residential neighbors in the town of Canmore. And the comments are generally along those, oh, look at how cute this is, and to that effect. So that is a problem, having those attractants in town and having the wildlife access them. So we have to stop feeding the wildlife. The bear-proof bins was a big step towards that, but it's only one step towards moving that. So we have to secure or remove attractants, and we have to reduce habituation. If we can deter people from feeding wildlife, we can reduce the likelihood of habituation. So we have recently passed our attractant bylaw in the town of Canmore. We have yet to do an actual enforcement based on that. What's interesting is that we essentially indicated that the bar for successful enforcement we'd essentially have to catch the bear eating the fruit in the tree in the yard. People have posted exactly that occurring in social media recently, so that is stuff that we are following up on with those residents. People compliance. This is perhaps our biggest challenge. The reality is that wildlife aren't that complicated. There are ways that we can influence their behavior. Unfortunately, when it comes to people, we have been less successful in influencing their behavior. So the picture that is up there obviously is members of public with a chariot carrying a child ducking under a closure tape in the midst of bear season when the bear closures last year. So if we need to find ways to get people to comply with the program to reduce this conflict. So that's communications, it's enforcement capacity. We need to do some research into understanding why people are making the choices that they are and behaving in the way that they are, and in order to effectively find ways to educate and communicate with them. And then obviously adaptive management, which is, this is going to be an ever-evolving process. So adaptive management essentially says, try something, see how it works, maintain the positive, and then adjust for any deficiencies that you might find. And that is a continuing and evolving process. So you continue to adapt the management practices as new information and experience evolves. So wildlife management, interestingly enough, although Bear 148 was the big story of last year, there were far more bears lost to the railroad and to the highway in any given year than there are due to relocations or translocations, for example. There is a significant need to look at highway mitigations for the Trans-Canada Highway. What's interesting is that you enter Banff National Park and the highway is fenced and the speed limit is 90 kilometers an hour. You exit Banff National Park onto the provincial area, the speed increases to 110, which is an effective speed of 120 to 130, depending on how heavy the person's foot is, and there is no fencing. Doing something to mitigate the Trans-Canada Highway is obviously a significant concern. Similarly with secondary highways, railway mortality mitigation is something that we have to look at as well, finding ways to keep the animals off the highway or off the railway. That's going to require cooperation with partners like CP, which will be a challenge that we will have to address. And then trying to reduce the translocations. So if we can get consistency across the agencies in terms of the management approach, we can potentially find ways to keep specifically bears, large carnivores, on the landscape more effectively rather than having to translocate them. And obviously a bear that is able to remain in place has a far better chance of survival than one who is translocated. So those were the key recommendations and a summary of the key recommendations. Quick discussion on next steps. So each jurisdiction has basically got to take this report back now and decide how they are planning to implement it and what they're going to implement. So for the town of Canmore, our practical next step is to request that council approve it for planning purposes. Then administration can go away and we can use this report to build out a budget and business plan that will include recommendations that are consistent with this report for council's consideration through the budget and planning process. So that's how we are planning to make use of the report. We are optimistic that the roundtable, so one of the biggest recommendations and the most significant recommendations out of the report is that the roundtable and the technical committee in some form need to endure. So there needs to be an ongoing platform. If the end result of this process was the completion of this report and then there is no further follow-up after that, then we would not be able to consider that this process was a success. So the need to continue to dedicate resources by all agencies, both in terms of staff time, but also in terms of financial time and political will, is a key recommendation going forward. So if the roundtable endures and then the technical committee either, we have another organization in the valley, BC Ag, which has been doing some similar type of work for a number of years. There should be some consideration about the future of that organization and how it relates to the roundtable and the technical committee, but ensuring that there is a platform going forward that will continue to provide the leadership and coordination of the implementation of these recommendations is going to be critical. And then there will be a need to identify actions for additional consultation. And so the biggest component of this from a consultation perspective going forward is the technical report. We didn't go out for consultation to see if people agreed or not with the data or the recommendations. Again, the technical committee was the subject matter experts and it was based on the best available evidence. Where we want to engage with the public is on the practical implementation of projects. So which projects, at what time, at what cost, and how quickly. Because getting the public acceptance and support behind that is going to be critical to the success of any of those initiatives. So there will be considerable ongoing consultation as these recommendations are rolled out over the next number of years. Which actually brings me to a bit of an aside. There was some discussion at the Committee of the Whole last week around the Quarry Lake Dog Park and where we're at with that. As indicated at that time, We are optimistic that the consolidation or the endurance of the roundtable and technical committee will result in a platform that can look specifically at recommendations, for example, for Quarry Lake, and help us to make informed decisions. In the interim period, it remains a status quo with the activities at Quarry Lake. But we do anticipate that we will be able to gain some better knowledge and understanding and come forward with some better recommendations if those platforms are able to continue. And similarly for the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor, there's still a motion on the books from Council to develop a management plan for the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. We need the cooperation and the existence of this platform in order to be able to do that effectively. So that concludes my summation of a presentation done by Alberta Parks. With that, we will come back to the recommendation, which is that Council approve or Council accept the report for planning purposes. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much. Well-polished presentation.
Somebody put a lot of work into that.
On the last note, I will mention that there's already in place a discussion with the members of the roundtable to reassemble in early fall. And I think one of the things we'll be discussing at the roundtable is trying to understand or wanting to know how the various jurisdictions are rolling this out in their jurisdictions and what next steps may be in the various jurisdictions so that that can inform how the town of Canmore moves forward, knowing particularly how the province will be implementing some of the recommendations. And I just wanted to make one comment on the written report under stakeholder engagement. You note that the Wildlife Coexistence Roundtable included representatives from all relevant government agencies, but I would suggest that it included representatives from all interested government agencies. The MD of Bighorn would certainly be relevant, but they were clear in expressing that they didn't have an interest in being involved in the roundtable. So there is a nuance there. Councillor Seeley, you have a question.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Fark, thanks for the presentation. This is really good information. I'm glad we're finally, I think we're moving the bar on this. As far as people compliance, what I've noticed, I've seen a lot more dogs on leash. So I think people are starting to get it just by entering the conversation. I think everyone wants to play. Right. So that's encouraging. And I have talked to bylaw, and they've noticed the same thing. Yeah.
What's interesting there on the off-leash dogs is that this year, both the province, their conservation officers, and town bylaw have been taking a zero-tolerance approach with off-leash dogs. So the number of enforcement actions that have been taken by both agencies has dramatically increased as well. And so that may also be a contributing factor why more people are keeping their dogs on leash.
Well, and they're starting to pay attention. I think that's critically important to this.
Not being a dog owner myself, I don't have insight, but perhaps the CAO might have some. That was a rhetorical question.
I guess that's my question. Just have you noticed the same in talking to bylaw? They've
yes. So bylaw, like I said, and the province hired 2 additional conservation officers to focus on enforcement in the valley over the busy summer period, and they have stepped up their enforcement activities, and that is largely a contributing factor to the increased compliance.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Fark. I had a question and a compliment. So my question is, with regards to those bylaw officers that have been afforded to the valley, is that just for the summer? Are those permanent summer positions, or? Sorry, what did I say?
Bylaw.
Sorry, I meant conservation officers, sorry.
So they're conservation officers. They were only for the summer, so they are not permanent, and they are not year-round.
So we're only for this summer?
Only for this summer at this point is our understanding.
Great, okay.
We would like to see them made permanently, obviously.
And then the compliment I wanted to lay, and I know that you didn't write this report yourself, but in speaking with Dr. Young, when we had the open house at the Union Hall in early summer, What I found really interesting about the report is generally when you read a report, they'll have like the, you know, sort of the executive summary, the report for dummies at the front end. And although it's not a very difficult read, the recommendations from this report are actually embedded in the context of the report. And I understood that that was actually purposeful. And it forces you to actually read the context in line with the recommendation, which is super important because I think we lose a lot of the conversation in that. And it forces you to actually thoughtfully read the document. And again, it's not a difficult read. I think I had it sewn up in 45 minutes. But if administration had anything to do with that, yahoo.
What's interesting is that the technical report really was a true collaborative effort. There were anywhere from 12 to 18 people on any given meeting involved in actually writing the report. So there are sections that each contributing agency wrote. So I wrote some paragraphs. Obviously, the wildlife biologist wrote a significant portion of it. It was a true collaborative effort. And then the compiling of all of that and then ensuring consistency and sort of a consistent voice across the document. But yeah, no, it was a true collaborative effort.
Well, what's clear in this is that no one measure is going to solve this problem, and that we have to continue trying a variety of different measures to try and
what I will say is that despite the fact that some of the recommendations could be considered as controversial or difficult to implement, there was consensus on every single one of the recommendations, despite the fact that different agencies came with different perspectives and different objectives, in fact, or different mandates.
Excellent. Well, that was my question and my compliment. Thank you.
Just to give credit where it's due, there was a professional report writer that the province contributed a number of resources to this project, one of which was this Jamie Peters, right? Yeah, so Jamie was responsible for coordinating the writing of the report and ensuring the consistent voice. She was not the content generator, so the content was actually generated by the technical committee members, and then she was responsible for bringing it all together and making it coherent and cohesive. All right. Councillor Comfort.
Yes, thank you for your report. Very pretty, very pretty. So it's apparent that consistency across the jurisdictions is going to be very important if we're actually going to be able to sort of wrestle this to the ground. So our neighbors to the east in the MD, that's one issue. But then westward in BC, they have completely different regulations and practices and so forth. Are we looking down the road to talk to our western neighbors?
So our western neighbors are actually Banff National Park, and the the park spans to the Alberta-BC border, and then it's a different national park. So for the purposes of this project, we did not extend beyond the park boundaries, and so we are not looking at that. However, the adjacent parks are also national parks, so they fall under similar management practices. So if we can get the coordination mechanism in place and work effectively with essentially federal parks, then that should address a fair bit of the coordination issues that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fark, for the presentation. I really did like reading this report, and I really liked the fact that it was consensus-based and that anything that was in this report was vetted by all those agencies, and that's a pretty broad spectrum of people to be looking at these issues. It's actually a very good read, and I think everybody in Canmore should read this report because it's very specifically involved in the Bow Valley. The fact that we're coming into fruit season right now is a bit of a concern for me because I think there are already bears around town. And it appears that the fruit is ripening somewhat earlier this year, too. There's crab apples that are ripening in my neighborhood right now, and there's bears in my neighborhood right now. So is there something that we can do to highlight the concern, especially that's just raised in this report in a number of ways?
So we already have a communication program initiated in the community, focused specifically at, and we are just making the transition now from actually berry season to fruit season. What's interesting is it wasn't a particularly good berry season this year, So we've had less problems with, especially with bears within the development footprint than we had last season up to this point. So there were not the area closures that we saw last year. But we are now moving into the fruit season, and there have been a number of incidents already. So we could see that occurring later in the season.
So in a communication process, could we make people aware that this is really a big issue? It's not just sort of...
We do everything we can to educate the public. So it's a combination of online, social media. We have the signs, the large flashing signs posted in certain neighborhoods as well, trying to highlight people so that as they drive by, they can see it. So we're not dependent on them accessing a type of media in order to hear the information. We have information in the newspaper, and I believe also on radio, do we not? You don't know. We will.
So it seems that the season's advancing quickly this year because of the hot and dryness, so we might be facing it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, entirely possible.
But this is a great report, so I hope that Canmore residents get a chance to read it because it's available on our website, correct?
It's available on the website, absolutely, yes.
Great, thanks.
You know, just to that point, Councillor Sanford, I think one of the real benefits of this process that we've been through and the resulting report is in the past, when the town of Canmore has tried to educate the public, at times there's been a tendency to dismiss what the town of Canmore is saying because what do we know? Now we've had a huge number of technical experts from across the agencies, governmental and non-governmental agencies, spent all this time and put this report together. So now it's not the town of Canmore saying X, Y, or Z. It's a number of people that are well respected in the valley as experts on the matter. And I think it was a good decision to include non-governmental agencies on that technical working group for similar reasons.
It certainly was not easy. I mean, we spent the first 3 meetings just arguing about lexicon.
Yeah.
And so finding the common ground and being able to have even the common language to be able to move forward was certainly a challenge. But over the 6-month period, we believe that the result speaks for itself.
Yeah, and you could speak to this perhaps, but I understand that the initial hurdle, which was attacked with enthusiasm, was to develop that cross-jurisdictional vocabulary and for the province to understand what informs Parks Canada's methods and approach, right, and vice versa. Absolutely.
I mean, we had entire hour-long discussions over what is a wary bear as opposed to what is a non-wary bear, or, you know, it's so that the management approaches could be understood in similar languages, because that was one of the challenges that we saw last summer was what the federal parks considered to be a risk and what the provincial parks considered to be a risk were different. They weren't speaking the same language. So getting the language consistent and agreed upon was the basis for being able to move everything else forward.
And similar benefits regarding practices like translocation, which is different from one area to the other.
Yeah, I mean, Banff National Park, their policy is to try to avoid translocation pretty much at all costs. And if they do move, they will often move them within the park. Provincial policy previously had been to translocate early on. Essentially, public safety was the primary concern, and often moved them to other management areas where their chances of survival were lower.
Yeah, so of course, moving forward, we're going to have to understand. I mean, right going into it, it was identified that there would be no one size fits all. So some of the recommendations will fit our needs, some won't. Some will meet the town of Banff's needs, some won't, and ditto with the federal and provincial agencies. So we went into the exercise understanding that it wouldn't be one simple solution for everybody. So it was quite a process.
But we, I mean, from administration's perspective, we are intending to bring forward as part of the budget and business planning process, initiatives that are based on the recommendations coming out of the wildlife report, assuming that council approves that this evening. So you'll start to see those initiatives and the implementation of that start immediately in 2019.
Are there other questions this time for Mr. Fark? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation. Then I will move the council accept the Human Wildlife Coexistence report for planning purposes. And in supporting the motion, I do want to once again briefly commend the many people who spent their winter and most of their spring, or all of their spring, I guess, on this project. It was a lot of work for a lot of people, and they really jumped into it with full enthusiasm, and I think the resulting report is clear evidence of not only the need but the interest amongst the people that live in the valley and monitor wildlife and work with wildlife issues, recognize the value of this exercise. So it will be important that we continue to coordinate and cooperate moving forward with various implementation points. But kudos to the people that were on the technical working group. And anybody else care to speak to the motion to accept the report for planning purposes? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. We can do item G6 and then take a break before the in-camera. So G6, appointment to the Marigold Library Board. Anybody speaking? Oh, Ms. Hyde, yep.
Thank you. Part of the agreement between our library board and the Marigold Services Library Board is that we provide 2 representatives to sit on the Marigold board, and they have to be appointed by council. So Judith Smith and Ann Medikosh have been sitting as those representatives for the last, I think, 1 and 2 years, respectively. And they're both fine with continuing, so it's just really a housekeeping item for you to approve their appointment. And it just coincides with their terms on our own library board. So once their terms are up, then we can select a new member.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any questions to that report? Seeing none, I'll move that council appoint Judith Smith as the Town of Canmore Library representative to the Marigold Library Board for a term ending at the 2020 annual organizational meeting, and that council appoint Ann Medikosh as the alternate Town of Canmore Library representative to the Marigold Library Board for a term ending at the 2018 annual organizational meeting. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Call a short break, and then we'll just come back for the 2 in-camera items. Opposed? Carried unanimously. Good to go?